So I just wanted to share a quick perspective, I guess, on presentations and how you're approaching the class. No one's doing anything wrong, but I just wanted to go ahead and give you a heads up because we're heading towards the direction of midterm. And I want to make sure that you're thinking about the class appropriately and the material that we're reading. So in the presentations and some of the discussions, I've noticed that we're staying really local with our interpretations of the stories. And so a lot of people will say this is a story that's about two people in love, or this is a story about people who don't like each other, that sort of thing. And really, if you break it down to that level, up through the entire semester, all of our stories will be about people in love or people who don't get along. If you think about going back to the Octoroon, going back to Margaret Fleming, onwards throughout the entire semester, as you go through, you'll see that it's all about people that are in love or people that are in conflict. So that's a good general statement. But what I really want you to do is start thinking about how this particular story is reflecting American culture or concerns at the time period. And so, for instance, if we were to go back to, let me just think of an example here. So if we go back to Sweatshop Romance, okay? It's about two people in love, but there's also issues about masculinity, right? So we have Belle, getting wooed by two different men. One of them win and one of them fails. Is there a perspective on what American culture wants men to act like around women? So that could be one way of pursuing that. Another thing would be, this is during a time period in which issues of Marxism and socialism and capitalism are all being bandied about in the United States. Immigration is an issue in the United States, it always is, but in this particular time period especially so. So think about, as you approach your stories in both your discussion boards and your presentations, broadening your perspective a little bit, because when we get to the midterm, I'm not going to ask about, tell me a story about people who are in love, or tell me a story about, talk about a story in which two people disagree with each other. I'm going to say, here is a trend in American history. Let's see here. So I would say, tell me about how class is represented in the material that we've read so far. Okay. And so by then, hopefully you will have gone through the discussion board, thought about it, and you can say, oh, right, Sweatshop Romance, so that talks about class, and so on. So that way you're able to sort of draw the picture a little bit more broadly in terms of the stories and what they're representing and what they're talking about. They're not being created in a vacuum. It's not as if the author sat down and said, I'm going to write about two people in love, or else nothing would ever get written because we'd all be writing the same things. But instead, or two people in conflict, but instead they're saying, what can I bring forward in this short story? How is this short story a product of the time? What are some contextual issues? What are some historical issues? What are some social issues, historical context required? All of those sorts of things have an impact on a story. And so, for instance, as we talk about, for instance, last week with Daisy Miller, there's all sorts of different things in terms of what masculinity is, right? And I once had a student famously describe Winterbourne as a weenie, right? He's too much of a wuss, right? He's not going out there and doing what he's supposed to win the woman. But the question becomes, is that appropriate behavior for the time period? Where some of the constraints that a character like Winterbourne would feel, essentially, as an American, I guess, expatriate time period, and as he pursues Daisy Miller, and how is Daisy Miller sort of defying the expectations that men have placed on women during that time period as well. So as you go through and you think about the presentations and your responses, kind of go a little bit broader, not more general, but a little bit more broader in terms of how you're interpreting the stories, and sort of extrapolate some of the material that you know from your history classes or your history knowledge that's already pre-existing, in terms of movements that are occurring in the United States, perspectives towards women, perspectives towards men, et cetera, et cetera. And that way you'll be a little more well prepared when we get to the midterm, because it's a little bit more nuanced, I think, in some ways than some people are expecting. And so again, as you go through that, broaden your perspective. Don't be general and don't break things down to just this story. This story is about two people who really don't like each other. Okay, but it's about so much more than that. That's just the basis of it. But you have all other sorts of issues, social, cultural, historical context that are occurring in the background. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. We do have some presentations this week. As usual, keep in mind one video presentation or one video response usually to the presentation, and then 2 written responses to other material that you may see. But on presentation weeks, there's no hard and fast rule. So if you want to do a video response to somebody else and then write a response to a presentation, et cetera, my only baseline really is that you're engaged in the class and you know what's going on from moment to moment. And I see your face once basically for a good period of time, and you're discussing the story, and then you're also writing about those particular stories. And as we get closer to the midterm, I think those things that you've gone through and sort of thought about will help you out greatly. So speaking of midterm really quickly, there'll be more details on that in the future. It'll be online through Blackboard. It'll be timed. I usually set the window for about a week. So you can hop in there at any time during a 5 days, 6 days, 7 day time frame. And then once you open it up, you have about 2 or 3 hours to complete it. You're expected to cite sources. You can use your notes, which I hope you've been taking this entire time, and so on. So I'll give you a little more details on that as we get closer to it, probably in like week 6 or 7. So other than that, just kind of keep doing what you're doing, but try to broaden your discussions out just a little bit more. If you have any questions, feel free to email.